Kaiser, daughter of the void. A story of survival, identity, and the price of protection. Sleepy summoner, welcome. Tonight you will descend into the depths of memory and stone, to walk alongside one who has carried both light and shadow within her. Close your eyes. Listen to the whisper of wind through ancient ruins and the quiet echo of a heart learning what it means to belong nowhere and protect everything. This is the story of Kaiser, the girl who came back. Settle in. The darkness below awaits. Part 1. The Before Time. Chapter 1. The Village of Dust and Dreaming. In the time before the rift, before the sky tore open and the bedrock split like cracking clay, there existed a village whose name has been swallowed into dust. It was not a place of great significance in the vast expanse of Shurima. It did not hold the strategic importance of the grand cities to the north. It was not a center of trade or commerce or learning. It was simply a small gathering of human beings who had chosen to make their home in the unforgiving landscape of the southern deserts. People who had learned to draw water from beneath the earth and to coax sustenance from soil that seemed barren and empty. The village was built in the manner of all Shuriman settlements in that region, clustered around a central well, with homes constructed of stone and clay, their walls thick enough to retain the cool of the early morning, even as the heat of midday pressed down relentlessly from above. The buildings were modest, their decorations simple, their purpose practical. These were not the homes of nobles or priests or those who wielded great power. These were the homes of ordinary people, farmers and merchants and craftspeople who labored each day to maintain the fragile balance between survival and comfort. The people who lived in this village, like people everywhere, desired the simple things that humans have always desired. They wanted safety. They wanted enough food to sustain themselves and their children. They wanted to know that when night fell and they lay down to sleep, they would wake again when the sun returned. They wanted the comfort of routine, the knowledge that tomorrow would resemble today, that the patterns of their lives would continue as they had continued before. Most of all, they wanted to know that their children would live. They wanted to see their children grow and mature and eventually have children of their own. They wanted to leave behind something that would persist after they themselves had passed from the world. This fundamental desire, this basic human impulse to ensure continuity and create meaning through progeny, was perhaps the deepest need that bound the people of the village together. One such family was the family of Kaiser. They were not wealthy. They possessed no great lands or elaborate homes. They had no claim to nobility or priestly authority. They were simply a family of modest means, perhaps slightly better off than some of their neighbors, but not dramatically so. Kaiser's father was a craftsperson of some skill, someone who worked with his hands and his knowledge to create items that were useful and durable. Her mother was the kind of woman who understood the practical skills necessary to maintain a household and raise children in a harsh environment. She knew which plants could be gathered safely from the surrounding lands. She understood the preservation techniques that allowed food to be stored for the times when fresh supplies grew scarce. Kaiser herself was a child like any other child, remarkable chiefly for being unremarkable. She was born into this family and grew up within the routines and rhythms of village life. She learned to move through the narrow streets between houses. She learned the names and the stories and the peculiarities of every adult who lived in the settlement. She learned the games that children played in the dust, games that were simple and required no equipment except imagination and the willingness of other children to participate. She had friends. There were other children who were close to her in age, who shared her experiences of growing up in a remote desert settlement, who knew what it meant to live under the constant awareness that the desert surrounding them was dangerous, and that one did not venture far from the safety of the village without good reason and adequate preparation. What made Kaiser different from many other children was not anything dramatic or obvious. It was simply a quality of awareness, a tendency to notice things that others overlooked. She possessed a kind of intelligence that expressed itself not through academic knowledge, which was not particularly available to village children, but through a kind of intuitive understanding of the world around her. She paid attention to the way that the wind moved. She understood the subtle signals that indicated whether a particular patch of the desert might be safe to explore, or whether it contained dangers that were best avoided. She had received a knife on her 8th birthday, a gift from her father that was both practical and symbolic. It was a tool that could be used for any number of purposes: cutting rope, preparing food, defending oneself if necessary. But it was also a gift that marked a stage of her development, a tool that suggested that she was becoming old enough to be trusted with implements that required care and attention to use safely. She had learned to handle the knife with respect and competence. She knew that her father had given it to her because he believed her capable of using it responsibly. In her 10th year of life, in a season that is marked by nothing particularly unusual or noteworthy, Kaiser existed in a state of innocent unknowing. She did not realize that the patterns of her life were about to be shattered in ways that could never be fully repaired. She did not understand that she was living in a time of change, that forces beyond her comprehension were beginning to move across the lands of Shurima, that the stable world she had known was about to be torn open and transformed into something entirely different. The first signs of the disturbance came as rumors. These rumors moved through the village slowly at first, whispered between adults in moments when they believed the children were not listening. There were strangers in the land, it was said. These strangers were not merchants or travelers or people engaged in the ordinary business of moving goods between distant settlements. They were people who came with animals, people who spoke of dark powers and strange practices, people who seemed to be engaged in activities that filled the ordinarily stoic desert dwellers with a kind of dread. The strangers spoke of tribute. They spoke of offerings to powers that dwelt beneath the earth. They spoke in ways that suggested these powers were not merely mythological or religious abstractions, but actual entities that could receive payment and could respond to those payments. The strangers brought sacrificial animals with them when they came to the villages. They conducted rituals that the ordinary people did not understand and did not particularly wish to understand. Kaisa's mother was among those who felt the creeping dread that these visitations inspired. She began to urge her daughter to remain close to home, not to venture out to the places where children normally played. She did not explain precisely why she was issuing these warnings. She did not tell Kaiser what she feared might happen if the girl strayed too far from the safety of her family home. But Kaiser understood from her mother's tone and her insistence that something was not right, that something in the normal order of the world had become disrupted. Kaiser, like many children, was not entirely willing to be constrained by the warnings of her elders. She had lived in the village her entire life. She understood her home and the lands immediately surrounding it. She felt a certain confidence that came from familiarity, a sense that she would be safe in places she had always moved through safely before. The warnings of adults seemed overly cautious to her, the kind of worried talk that grew up around any unusual occurrence, but that rarely resulted in any actual danger. Chapter 2. The Knife, the Goats, and the Awakening. It was during an evening in this season of creeping dread that Kaiser, along with some of her friends, came upon a sight that sparked both curiosity and rebellion in her young mind. At the outskirts of the village, in a clearing that was sometimes used as a holding place for animals being traded in the market, there was a pen of goats. These animals had been brought by the nomadic herdsmen who worked with the strangers, the visitors who were conducting their mysterious rituals. The goats had been designated as sacrificial animals, payment for the dark powers that supposedly dwelt beneath the earth. To the children of the village, particularly to Kaiser, the existence of these animals seemed wrong. The goats were innocent creatures, animals that had done nothing to deserve whatever fate the adults had planned for them. The children discussed this amongst themselves. They spoke of the unfairness of it. They wondered about the purpose of the rituals, the meaning of the sacrifices. And gradually, from this discussion, an idea emerged, an idea that seemed to combine practical action with a kind of moral rebellion. Kaiser would free the goats. She would cut them loose from their pens and set them free into the canyon lands beyond the village, where they might have at least a chance at survival, where they might escape whatever dark purpose the rituals were intended to serve. It seemed like a perfect plan to children who were still young enough to believe that good intentions and brave action were sufficient to overcome any consequence. Kaiser took the knife that her father had given her, the tool that was meant to be used responsibly and with care. She made her way to the pen where the goats were being held. Her hands were steady, her resolve firm. She did not hesitate as she cut through the ropes that were holding the animals in place. The goats, suddenly freed from their constraints, scattered with the panic of animals that suddenly found their bonds removed. They fled in various directions, but many of them made their way toward the nearby canyon, following the terrain toward places where they might find water and vegetation. To Kaiser in that moment, it seemed like a successful act of liberation, a minor victory against the systems of cruelty and control that she perceived the adults to be perpetrating. She did not realize that the act of liberation was itself a kind of message, a kind of signal being sent out into the world. She did not understand that in cutting the ropes and setting the animals free, she had inadvertently done something that would serve as a kind of trigger, an action that would awaken things that had been deliberately kept dormant and sealed away. The nomadic herdsmen who had brought the goats discovered the empty pen. Word of the escape spread quickly through the village. There was confusion initially, a kind of scrambling to understand what had happened. But then, quite rapidly, understanding began to crystallize. Someone had freed the animals, Someone had deliberately destroyed the sacrificial offering that had been so carefully prepared. The herdsmen who had been involved in the ritual process were clearly distressed by this development. They gathered in small groups, speaking urgently to one another, their voices carrying tones of concern and alarm. The adults of the village attempted to understand what had transpired and what the consequences might be. Some of them, perhaps, began to suspect which child had been responsible for the liberation of the animals. But in that moment, before consequence could catch up with cause, something else occurred. The ground began to tremble. It was not a subtle vibration or a small tremor that might be easily dismissed or rationalized as part of the normal phenomena that occasionally occurred in the desert. It was a violent shaking, a massive disturbance in the very bedrock beneath the village. The tremor was strong enough that people were knocked to their knees. Objects that had been carefully arranged fell and scattered. The structures of stone and clay that made up the village began to shift and crack and fracture. But this was only the beginning. Flashes of light scorched the sky, light that did not come from the sun, and that seemed to emerge from places both above and below at the same time. The light carried with it a quality that was fundamentally wrong, that seemed to violate something basic about the nature of the world. It was not ordinary light. It was light that carried within it an almost physical pressure, light that seemed to push against the normal structure of reality itself. And then the sky tore open. It was not a metaphorical tearing or a poetic description of what occurred. It was a literal rupture in the sky, a great rift that split the very heavens, revealing not the void of space but something far worse. The rift was a wound through which something vast and terrible was attempting to push its way into the world, something that belonged to no natural category of existence, something that existed in violation of all the normal rules and structures that kept reality orderly and comprehensible. Through this rift came creatures and forces that should never have been allowed to enter the world of Runeterra. They were things that existed in spaces between spaces, entities that had been sealed away in ages past because their very presence was fundamentally corrosive to the existence of normal life. They were the void made manifest, the emptiness that hungered to consume everything, to annihilate all existence, to leave nothing behind except the absolute absence of being. The bedrock beneath the village split and opened, creating fissures and chasms that swallowed structures whole. The earth seemed to come alive with a terrible hunger, pulling down buildings and people alike into depths that seemed almost bottomless. The screams of the villagers filled the air, cries of terror and pain, and the recognition that something absolutely catastrophic was occurring, something that transcended the normal calamities that human beings encountered in their lives. The village, which had stood for generations, which had been home to families that had lived there for centuries, which had seemed as permanent and as unchangeable as the desert itself, was being destroyed. It was being consumed. It was being swallowed whole by forces that cared nothing for the human significance of the place, that regarded the settlement and its inhabitants as nothing more than food or obstacles to be consumed or cast aside. Kaiser, in that moment, understood with the clarity that sometimes comes to people in the instant before catastrophe fully materializes that she had done this. Her action, her decision to free the goats, had somehow triggered this response. She did not fully understand the mechanism of it. She did not comprehend the forces that she had unleashed or the purpose that they were now pursuing. But she understood with absolute certainty that the destruction that was consuming her village was a direct consequence of her actions. This knowledge, this terrible guilt and fear and desperate need to survive, would become the foundation of everything that Kaiser would become in the years that followed. In that moment, as the world around her collapsed and the screams of her family and friends filled the air, she became aware of something that would haunt her for the rest of her existence. She had caused this. She had not meant to. She had acted with what she had believed were good intentions, but intention was irrelevant. Consequence was all that mattered. The consequence was death. The consequence was destruction. The consequence was the annihilation of everything she had known and everyone she had loved. Part 2. The Descent. Chapter 3. The Darkness Below. Kaiser became aware gradually of being underground. She could not have said, in those first moments of consciousness, exactly what had transpired or how she had come to be in this place. Her memories were fragmentary, broken apart like pieces of pottery that had been smashed and scattered. She remembered the ground shaking. She remembered the terrible light. She remembered the sensation of falling, of being pulled downward through space that twisted and seemed to fold back on itself in ways that did not correspond to the normal geometry of the world. What she perceived now was darkness. Not the darkness of night, which she had known in the village. Darkness that was simply the absence of the sun, and that gradually resolved itself into a kind of visibility as her eyes adjusted and as starlight illuminated the landscape. This was a different kind of darkness, a darkness so complete that it seemed to have weight and texture, a darkness that seemed to press against her from all sides, and that seemed to resist her efforts to see through it. As time passed, and as her senses gradually became more active and more aware, she became conscious of other things. She could hear sounds, faint and distant, sounds that might have been the voices of other survivors. Some of these voices were calling out names. Some of them were crying. Some of them were simply making noise, sounds of pain or despair, or the animal noises that human beings make when they are injured or terrified or displaced from all sense of safety and normalcy. The air around her was cold. It was not the cold of winter or of high altitude, which she had never experienced but had heard her parents discuss. It was a different kind of cold, a cold that seemed to come from deep within the earth, from places that the warmth of the sun could never reach. This cold seemed to carry with it a kind of wrongness, a quality that suggested that it was not an ordinary environmental condition, but rather a quality that was intrinsic to this place, that was fundamental to its nature. She became aware that she was alone. The other people who might have been trapped with her, if they had indeed survived the initial collapse of the village, were not present. There was only herself, and the terrible silence that surrounded her, broken only by the occasional faint sound of falling stone, or the creeping sense that something was moving through the darkness at a distance she could not quite perceive. She called out. She called for her mother. She called for her father. She called for her friends, for any of the adults of the village, for anyone at all who might be nearby and who might be able to help her understand what had happened and what she should do next. Her voice echoed strangely in the enclosed space, bouncing off surfaces that she could not see, multiplying itself in ways that made it seem as though she was calling out again and again, as though her own voice was answering itself from the darkness. But no one responded. Time became difficult to measure. In the absence of the normal signals that mark the passage of time, in the darkness that made it impossible to know whether hours or days had passed, Kajsa found herself existing in a state that was almost outside of time. She tried to move, to understand her environment, to find some way to escape the place where she had become trapped. The ground beneath her was uneven, covered with debris and rubble and the scattered remnants of the village that had been pulled down into this abyss. She could feel fragments of stone and clay beneath her hands when she reached out tentatively to explore her surroundings. She could feel the texture of broken pottery, pieces that had once been vessels or tools or decorative objects that had belonged to her people. Some of these fragments still carried with them a sense of the purposes they had served in the world above. She found what had once been a cooking vessel. She found the remains of something that might have been a drinking cup. These objects, rendered useless by the destruction that had consumed them, seemed to speak to her of the normalcy of the world that had existed only hours before, a normalcy that now seemed infinitely distant and impossibly lost. She tried to find water. She succeeded in locating a skin that had belonged to one of the adults of the village, a water carrier that had been pulled down in the collapse. The water inside was still cool, and she drank from it carefully, rationing what remained, understanding in some instinctive way that she did not know how long she would need to survive on this supply. She found fragments of food as well. There were remnants of peaches that had been dried and preserved, provisions that had been part of the stores that the village kept for times when fresh food grew scarce. The taste of the peaches was bittersweet, carrying with it the memory of ordinary times when she had eaten such fruits as part of the normal progression of her days, when food had been something that was simply available rather than something that needed to be desperately sought and carefully rationed. But even as she found these small supplies, she became increasingly aware that she was not alone in this place. There were sounds that could not be attributed to falling stone or the settling of rubble. There were sounds that suggested movement, that suggested the presence of living things moving through the darkness around her. Some of these sounds were small and skittering, the sounds of creatures that might be no larger than a hand, creatures that had perhaps made their homes in caves before the collapse, and that continued their ordinary lives in this place that had become a tomb for human beings. But there were other sounds as well, sounds that were larger, sounds that suggested the movement of things that were substantial and heavy, sounds that carried with them a quality that made the primitive parts of Kajsa's mind scream warnings, that triggered something deep and ancient within her awareness that responded to these sounds with fear and the recognition of danger. She followed the light that appeared to be leading her deeper into the cavern system. This was not a deliberate choice, but rather an unconscious drift, a movement that happened because she was still alive and still capable of movement, and there was no clear reason to stay in the place where she was when movement might lead her somewhere else. And perhaps, at some level of consciousness, that she did not fully acknowledge to herself. She hoped that by moving deeper into this place, she might find some passage that led back to the surface, some way out of the darkness and back to the world above. The light that she followed was not normal light. It was a faint luminescence that seemed to come from the walls of the caverns themselves, a kind of glow that was not bright enough to illuminate details clearly, but that was sufficient to allow her to perceive the general shape and direction of her movement. This light had a color to it, a purplish hue that seemed almost organic, as though it was not merely the reflection of light against stone, but rather something that the stone itself was generating. As she moved deeper into the cavern, she began to see things that confirmed her growing sense of wrongness. The stones themselves seemed to have taken on forms that did not accord with ordinary geology. There were formations that seemed almost intentional, that seemed to suggest intelligence or purposefulness in their configuration. There were surfaces that seemed to pulse or shift or change as she looked at them. Surfaces that seemed almost alive in some fundamental way. The air grew colder as she descended. It grew denser as well, heavier, carrying with it a quality that made each breath feel like an effort, like she was pulling something into her lungs that was not quite the same as the air she was accustomed to breathing. There was a taste to it, something that was almost metallic, almost organic, something that seemed to carry within it some essence or quality that did not belong to the normal atmosphere of the world above. And still she moved deeper, and still the sounds continued, the sounds of other things moving through this place, the sounds of creatures that belonged to this space, creatures that had made their homes here in depths where the sun never reached, and where the rules that governed the world above did not seem to apply. Chapter 4. The first encounter. It was hunger that finally drove Kaiser to acknowledge what she had been aware of on some level for some time. She was running out of supplies. The water skin had run dry. The peaches were gone. The minor sustenance she had found in the initial moments after her fall into this place had been consumed, and there was nothing remaining but the terrible knowledge that she would need to find food or starve. This knowledge triggered the first moment of true desperation that she experienced after the initial collapse of her village. Until this moment, there had been the possibility that rescue might come, that adults from neighboring settlements might somehow discover her and pull her back to the world above. There had been the possibility that this nightmare might resolve itself, that she might wake up in her own bed in her own home to discover that all of this had been nothing more than a fever dream, a nightmare born from stress and fear and the unusual events that had been occurring around the village in the weeks before the collapse. But the hunger made clear that this was not going to happen. This was real. She was truly here, in the depths beneath the earth, and she was truly alone, and she needed to find sustenance or she would die. It was this desperation that led her to venture into parts of the cavern system that she would not have explored otherwise. It was this desperation that led her to search in crevices and under stones, that led her to investigate the strange flora and fungi that seemed to grow in this place. Strange plants that did not seem quite like the plants that grew in the world above. Plants that seemed to embody the same kind of wrongness that characterized everything about this underground realm. She found things to eat. She found fungi that grew in formations on the walls, fungi that had a faint luminescence to them, fungi that seemed almost alive as she gathered them. She ate them cautiously at first, understanding that some fungi were poisonous, but her hunger overrode her caution. She did not become ill. Perhaps the fungi belonged to species that had no toxins, or perhaps her body had adapted quickly to this new environment. She did not know. She only knew that the fungi provided some measure of sustenance, that they seemed to quiet the desperate screaming of her hunger, at least temporarily. It was during one of these foraging expeditions, in the dimness that characterized the constant gloom of the caverns, that she became aware that something large had entered the space where she was moving. She became aware of it not through sight, but through a kind of pressure, a sense that the air around her had been displaced by something substantial, something that was not small enough to ignore. She turned, and she saw it. It was not possible to take in all the details of the creature at once. It was too large, and the light was too poor, and the mind rebelled against fully comprehending what the eyes were perceiving. But she could understand enough to know that this was not anything that belonged to the natural world as she understood it. It was not an animal like the goats or the sheep that existed in her village. It was not a creature that corresponded to any category of living thing that she had encountered, or that she had been told about through the stories and teachings of her people. The creature was grotesque. It seemed to embody a kind of violation of the normal principles that should govern the shape and form of a living being. It had too many limbs, or limbs that were configured in ways that did not correspond to any known anatomy. It had a mouth that was not quite a mouth, an opening that seemed to contain more teeth than should be possible, teeth that seemed to be made of a material that was harder and colder than bone. Its body seemed to be covered in some kind of carapace, a shell or armoring that seemed to be made of a substance that was not quite flesh and not quite mineral. It moved toward her. Kaiser, in that moment, made a decision that would define her entire existence in the ages to come. She did not freeze. She did not simply stand there and wait to be consumed or destroyed by this creature that was moving toward her with clear intent. Instead, she reached for the knife that had been hanging at her waist, the knife that her father had given her, the knife that she had used to cut the ropes and free the goats, the knife that had indirectly caused all of this horror and destruction. The creature knocked her to the ground. It was fast and strong, and it moved with a kind of terrible grace that betrayed intelligence and predatory skill. It slammed into her with the force of a small boulder, and she felt her breath driven out of her body, felt the terrible impact of the collision reverberating through every part of her being. But she had retained her grip on the knife. In the instant of contact, in the moment when the creature was nearest to her, when the terrible wrongness of its physical form was most immediate and most overwhelming, she thrust the blade upward with all the strength that she could muster. She felt the knife penetrate something, felt the resistance of the carapace giving way to the pressure of the blade, felt the knife sink deeper into the body of the creature. The creature convulsed. It made a sound that was not a scream, but something far worse. A kind of shriek that seemed to bypass her ears entirely, and that seemed to resonate directly in her bones and in her very consciousness. The creature thrashed and convulsed and twisted, and Kaiser, still gripping the knife, was pulled deeper into the creature's body, both of them tumbling through the darkness and falling into depths that seemed even more bottomless than the initial abyss into which she had been pulled. They fell through space. They fell through layers of cavern and stone. They fell through places where the light grew even stranger and even more wrong, places where the walls themselves seemed to pulse and shift and seem almost alive. And then finally, they stopped falling. They came to rest against the floor of some even deeper chamber, and Kaiser found herself on top of the creature, or perhaps beneath it, the confusion of the fall making it impossible to maintain perfect orientation. The creature was not moving. It was not making sounds. The terrible shriek had ceased. The convulsing had stopped. The creature, it seemed, was dead. Kaiser had killed it. It took her several moments to fully understand what had happened. It took her several moments to comprehend that she had defeated this creature that was so much larger than herself, that embodied so much more power, that belonged so completely to this dark realm in a way that she did not. But slowly, as the adrenaline that had powered her action began to subside, and as her consciousness began to reassert itself, she came to accept the impossible truth. She had survived this encounter. She had killed the creature. She was still alive. But something else had happened as well, something that was far more significant than the mere fact of survival. In the collision with the creature, in the struggle and the fall and the ultimate death of the beast, something had transferred between them. The creature was not dissolving. It was not simply ceasing to exist as a dead thing should. Instead, its form seemed to be merging with her own, its carapace and its flesh and some essence that was fundamental to what it was seemed to be binding itself to her skin, adhering to her, becoming part of her in ways that she could not fully comprehend or control. She tried to remove it. She reached for the knife, or what remained of the knife, which had broken under the strain of penetrating the creature's protective shell. But the darkness on her arm, the hardening carapace of the dead creature, would not come free. It was bonded to her at the most fundamental level. It was not sitting on top of her skin. It was becoming part of her skin, integrating itself into her body in ways that were deeply wrong, and that she could not prevent or stop. The tingling sensation that accompanied this integration was both terrible and strangely bearable. It was as though every nerve in the area was being awakened and stimulated at once, as though her entire arm was being remade from the inside out. She bore it because she had no choice, because resistance was impossible, because she was still alive and still conscious, and that seemed to be all that mattered in this moment. When the integration ceased, when the tingling subsided, and her arm settled back into a new kind of equilibrium, she found that she had been transformed. Her arm was no longer simply her arm. It was now covered with a dark, hard substance, a carapace that seemed to be grown rather than added, that seemed to be as much a part of her now as her original flesh had been. It was cold to the touch. It was harder than bone. It seemed to carry with it a kind of property that suggested it might be useful for defense, that it might serve as armor against the dangers that existed in this place. She would not have chosen this transformation. She wouldn't have agreed to it if she had been given the choice. But she had been given no choice. The transformation had happened to her, and now she had to decide what to do about it. how to live with this terrible thing that had become part of her body and that would, she dimly understood, only grow more extensive as the ages passed. Part 3. The Transformation. Chapter 5. The years of becoming years passed. Time, which had been difficult to measure in the early days of her imprisonment underground, gradually developed a kind of structure and rhythm that Kaiser learned to recognize and to move within. There was the rhythm of hunger and feeding. There was the rhythm of exploration and contraction, of expanding the territory that she moved through and then retreating back to places that she knew were relatively safe. There was the rhythm of slow physical and mental adaptation to her environment, the process by which her body and her consciousness gradually became acclimated to this terrible place that had become her entire world. The carapace that had begun on her arm gradually extended and expanded as she moved through the caverns and killed other creatures in order to survive, as she engaged in countless struggles for dominance and for food. The dark shell seemed to grow, spreading across her shoulders, extending down her sides, gradually covering more and more of her body. She had not chosen this growth, nor could she have stopped it even if she had wished to. It was simply what happened, a natural consequence of the symbiotic relationship that had developed between herself and the alien matter that had fused itself to her in that first terrible encounter with the creature. The growth was not painful in the way that physical injury was painful. Instead, it was an itch, a constant sensation of something shifting and changing and evolving beneath and across her skin. It was the kind of itch that could not be scratched, that could not be relieved by any kind of physical action, that seemed to resonate from deep within her body, and that seemed to speak to something fundamental about the nature of the transformation that was occurring. But as time passed, and as she adapted to the growth, she began to understand that the transformation was not merely a liability or a burden that she had to bear. The carapace provided protection. It made her more resistant to the attacks of the creatures that shared this underground realm with her. It made her stronger, more durable, more capable of surviving the conflicts that were a constant feature of life in the depths. More than this, she began to understand that the carapace was itself alive in some fundamental way, that it was not merely inert armor, but rather something that was conscious and aware, and that was linked to her consciousness in ways that were subtle and complex. She began to sense, through the carapace, the presence of other creatures nearby. She began to understand, through some kind of perception, that was not quite sight and not quite hearing, where threats and dangers and opportunities for feeding existed in the surrounding caverns. The carapace fed on the creatures that she killed. She began to understand this as she killed more and more of the Voidborn that inhabited this place. The dark matter would flow from the creatures she slew, would incorporate itself into her carapace, would strengthen and enhance and extend it. And as this happened, she would feel a kind of satisfaction, a sense that this cycle of killing and feeding and growth was something that served a purpose, that fulfilled some fundamental need both of the carapace and of herself. During this period of transformation, Kaiser was not entirely alone. There were other survivors from the village, survivors who had been pulled down into the abyss as she had been pulled down. In the earliest days, in the times immediately after the collapse, she had heard their voices. She had attempted to reach them, to find them in the darkness, to establish some kind of connection with other human beings who shared her fate. But the other survivors were not equipped for survival in this place, as Kaiser was beginning to become equipped. They did not have the benefit of the symbiotic transformation. They did not have the carapace that provided protection and strength and the ability to sense danger and opportunity. One by one, they fell to the creatures of this realm. One by one, their voices ceased to echo through the caverns. One by one, they died until Kaiser was truly alone, the sole human being remaining in the depths, the sole remnant of her people. But their deaths were not meaningless to her. She learned from them. She learned what mistakes to avoid. She learned what kinds of sounds and smells and signs indicated the presence of lethal danger. She learned what parts of the caverns were safest, where she could retreat when she was injured or exhausted, where she could rest without being attacked while she was sleeping. And through all of this learning, through all of this hard-won wisdom accumulated through countless narrow escapes and terrible encounters, she came to understand something fundamental. She was not going to be rescued. No one from the world above was going to come down and pull her back to the surface. No magical intervention was going to transport her away from this place. She was here, and she was going to be here for the rest of her life, for however long that might be. This understanding, rather than crushing her, seemed to focus her. It gave her a kind of clarity about her purpose and her future. She could not escape, but perhaps she could do something else. Perhaps she could, in some meaningful way, make use of what she was becoming. Perhaps she could use the strength and the abilities that the carapace was granting her to protect the world above from the horrors that existed in this place. It was during this period of transformation and self-discovery that Kaiser made a decision. She decided that she would become a hunter, not out of any great moral imperative or heroic calling, but out of a simple recognition that she had to feed herself, that the carapace required sustenance, that her survival depended on the continued killing and consumption of the creatures of this realm. But as she pursued this hunting, as she became increasingly skilled at identifying and tracking and destroying the voidborn of the caverns, she began to understand something else. The creatures she was killing were not passive or harmless. They were agents of consumption. They were expressions of the fundamental hunger that characterized the void. And every creature that she killed was a creature that could not move toward the surface world. Every creature that she destroyed was a creature that could not participate in the consumption of Runeterra. And so her hunting became something more than mere survival. It became a kind of purpose. It became a way of protecting the world above, a way of ensuring that the horrors of this place remain contained within the depths, a way of pushing back, however minutely, against the endless hunger that seemed to characterize this realm. Chapter 6. The Silence of Understanding. By the time Kaiser had been living in the depths for 10 years, the vast majority of her childhood had been consumed. The girl that she had been, the child who had lived in a village and who had played with friends and who had received a knife as a gift on her 8th birthday, that girl was gone. She was not dead. She was not forgotten. Her memories of that time were still present in Kaiser's consciousness, still available for her to access and to reflect upon. But the person who accessed those memories was not the same person who who had experienced them. The transformation was complete, or at least as complete as it was going to become. What Kaiser had become was something that was difficult to categorize. She was still human, in the sense that she possessed human consciousness and human memories and human capacity for reflection and emotion. But she was also something else. She was a being who existed between worlds, a being who belonged to neither the world of humans above nor to the world of void creatures below, but who occupied a strange and difficult space in between. Her body had been transformed to an almost unrecognizable degree. The carapace covered most of her now. It extended across her shoulders and down her back. It covered her sides and protected her vital organs. Only her face and certain areas of her body remained uncovered, remained recognizable as human flesh. Her strength had increased enormously. Her speed and her reflexes had been enhanced far beyond what a normal human could achieve. Her senses had been expanded and altered. She could perceive things through the carapace that she could not perceive through normal human senses. She could sense the movement of creatures through the surrounding stone. She could feel vibrations that traveled through the earth from distances that should have been too great for perception. But more than her body, her mind had been transformed as well. She had learned to suppress the constant stream of fear and horror that had characterized her early days in the depths. She had learned to think clearly in the midst of combat, to make rapid decisions about tactics and strategy, to understand the patterns of behavior that characterized the creatures she hunted. She had learned, perhaps most importantly, to accept the strange intimacy of the symbiotic relationship that existed between herself and the carapace. This last transformation was perhaps the most profound. In the early days, she had experienced the carapace as an intrusion, an alien presence that had been forced upon her, a violation of her body and her being. She had tried to resist it and to deny it, and to find ways to remove it, though none of these efforts had been successful. But as time passed, and as she came to understand that the carapace was not going away, that it was as much a part of her now as her original flesh, she came to accept it. More than accept it, she came to understand it. She came to hear, through its tissue and its awareness, something that was almost like communication. It was not words, and it was not clear or distinct thoughts, but it was a kind of knowledge that seemed to be transmitted directly from the carapace to her consciousness, a kind of wisdom about the nature of the creatures she hunted and about the resources that existed in this realm. There was a moment during her 10th year in the depths when she came to understand that she was no longer actively struggling against her circumstances. She was not fighting to escape or to be rescued. She was not constantly struggling against the reality of her situation. Instead, she had simply accepted it. She had become integrated with her environment in ways that she could not have imagined in her childhood. She had become native to this place, a creature of the depths, a being who was as much a part of this underground world as the stone itself. This acceptance brought with it a kind of peace. Not the kind of peace that came from happiness or contentment, or from getting what one wanted. Rather, it was the kind of peace that came from accepting the fundamental reality of one's situation, from ceasing to struggle against things that could not be changed, from finding some kind of meaning and purpose within the constraints of one's circumstances. She was a hunter. She was a protector. She was a barrier between the world above and the horrors of the depths. This was not the life that she would have chosen. This was not the destiny that she would have wished for herself when she was a child in the village, dreaming of a future that would be similar to the lives of her parents and the lives of all the adults around her. But it was the life that was available to her, and she had found within it a kind of meaning that transcended the tragedy of her circumstances. Part 4. The Surface World. Chapter 7. The Hunger for Above. It was on a day like many other days that Kaiser first felt the pull toward the surface. The carapace, which had become so intimately linked with her consciousness over the years, began to send her sensations that were different from the usual perceptions of nearby voidborn or available hunting grounds. Instead of information about her immediate surroundings, the carapace seemed to be conveying something else, something that was almost like an itch, or like an incomplete thought trying to form itself in her consciousness. This sensation pulled her in a particular direction. It guided her through the network of caverns that she had come to know intimately over the years. It guided her toward passages that were different from the usual hunting grounds, toward directions that she had not traveled in years, or possibly had never traveled at all. As she moved in the direction of this pull, as she followed the increasingly insistent guidance of the carapace, she began to notice changes in her environment. The air, which in the depths below was cold and heavy with that metallic organic taste, began to shift. There was a different quality to it, a lightness and a freshness that seemed almost alien to her, that seemed to carry with it the memory of something she had known long ago. The light began to change as well. The purplish glow that characterized the depths gradually shifted and transformed. Colors began to appear, colors that were not the colors of the void-touched stone, but rather something else, something that seemed almost familiar despite the length of time that had passed since she had last experienced anything similar. And finally, after hours of following this pull, after moving through passages and chambers and cavern systems that seemed to stretch upward and outward in ways that were different from the usual geometry of the depths, she emerged into a canyon under the open sky. The sky itself was almost overwhelming. For 10 years, her entire world had been enclosed, had been bounded by stone and darkness. Now, suddenly, above her stretched an expanse of open air, a vastness that seemed to extend infinitely upward. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple. The sight of it, the sheer visual impact of it, was almost too much for her consciousness to process. She stood frozen at the edge of the canyon, staring upward at the sky, barely able to comprehend what she was experiencing. The sun was warm on her skin. Even at the distance, it had descended toward the horizon. The air on her face was different from the air of the depths. The ground beneath her feet, although it was still stone and rock, had a different quality to it, was closer to the stone she remembered from her childhood than the strange, alien stone of the caves below. But it was not just the physical sensations that overwhelmed her. It was the emotional response as well. She felt tears running down her face, tears that she did not remember deciding to shed, but that seemed to be the natural response of a part of her consciousness that had held onto the memory of the world above all these years, that had carried within it the hope that she might someday see it again. She stood there in that canyon as the sun descended further and as the sky gradually darkened into night. She stood there as stars began to appear, stars that she could see from the depths only in rare moments when she had ventured to the highest points of the cave system. She stood there and she wept. But as the night deepened and as her emotions began to settle, she became aware of something else. She became aware that this return to the surface, this emergence from the depths, was not going to be permanent. The carapace, now that it had brought her here, was sending her signals that were very different from the itch and pull that had guided her toward the surface. Now it was sending her something that felt almost like pain, like an incompleteness, like a fundamental wrongness that came from being in this place, in the open air, separated from the depths that had become her home. She understood, with a clarity that seemed to come from the carapace as much as from her own consciousness, that she could not remain in this place. She could not simply walk back to the village and try to resume a human life. Her body would begin to wither if she stayed for too long away from the void-touch places that had sustained her. The carapace would begin to fail, and without the carapace, she would not survive in either the world above or in the depths. She also understood that she was not fully human anymore. She was not something that the people of the surface world would recognize as a person. If she were to be discovered, if she were to make herself known, she would likely be seen as a monster, as a creature of the void, as something that needed to be destroyed. And so, after only a short time in the canyon, after watching the stars for a while and feeling the night air on her skin, she turned and made her way back down into the depths. But she did not go all the way back to the places where she usually hunted. Instead, she positioned herself at a point that was close to the surface, but not so close as to cause harm to herself. She established a territory in the caverns just below the point where she had emerged, a place from which she could sense what occurred in the canyon above, a place where she could remain connected to the world above without being fully present within it. Chapter 8. The duty that defines. In the years that followed her emergence and her decision to remain at the boundary between worlds, Kaiser came to understand more fully the purpose that had always been implicit in her survival and her transformation. She was not merely a survivor of the void. She was a guardian, a protector, a barrier between the world above and the endless hunger of the depths. She began to perceive, through the carapace and through her own senses, the occasions when the barriers between the two worlds were being worn thin, when the void seemed to be pressing upward with particular force. At these times, she would position herself at the boundaries, ready to defend if necessary, ready to prevent creatures from ascending to the surface, ready to push back against the endless consuming pressure of the depths. During this period, she also encountered something that she had not experienced since the early days of her transformation: the presence of human beings. They came to the canyon sometimes, people from villages in the surrounding region who had heard rumors of the void and who were attempting to defend themselves against it or to understand it. Some of them were warriors, trained fighters who carried weapons and who moved with the confidence of those who had trained for combat. Others were priests or shamans or people who seemed to have some kind of connection to the spiritual or magical aspects of the world. Kaiser watched them from a distance. She observed their activities. She began to understand, through watching them and through overhearing their conversations, something about how the world had changed in the years that she had been in the depths. She understood that she was not the only one who was aware of the threat posed by the void. There were people in the world above who had dedicated themselves to fighting it, who had made it their life work to understand it and to defend against it. But she also understood that these people did not know what she knew, did not understand the true nature of the void or the depth of the hunger that characterized it. They saw it as an external threat, something that could be fought and potentially defeated through courage and skill and determination. They did not understand that the void was not simply an enemy in the way that one nation might be an enemy to another. The void was not fighting for territory or resources or for any of the things that motivated human conflicts. The void simply wanted to consume. It wanted to annihilate. It wanted to expand until there was nothing remaining except the absolute emptiness that was its fundamental nature. It was during this period of observation and understanding that Kaiser came to comprehend something about her own situation and her own purpose. She could not defeat the void. No single being, no matter how strong or how determined or how transformed by survival in the depths, could defeat something as vast and as fundamental as the void. But she could contain it. She could prevent its expansion. She could kill creatures before they reached the surface. She could be a damming force, a barrier that held back the tide, even if the tide could never be fully defeated. And there was meaning in that. There was purpose in that. Even if she would be doing it forever, even if she would never experience the resolution of knowing that the threat had been eliminated or controlled, even if her efforts would ultimately be a kind of endless maintenance that prevented things from becoming worse, even as it prevented them from becoming better, there was meaning and purpose in that work. She began to venture upward more frequently, to position herself even closer to the surface, to make her presence felt, at least subtly, in the world above. She wanted the people of the surface to know that they were not alone, that there was something standing between them and the horrors of the depths, that they had a guardian even if they did not know the form that this guardian took, or what the price of its protection had been. Chapter 9. The Girl Who Came Back. It was years later, long after Kaiser had established herself as a permanent barrier at the boundary between the depths and the surface, long after she had come to accept her role as a hunter and a protector, that she encountered a young girl at the edge of a canyon. The girl was different from the warriors and the priests and the other people she had observed from a distance. She was young, perhaps around 10 years old, around the same age that Kaiser herself had been when her village was destroyed. She carried an arrow and a small bow, and she seemed to be attempting to hunt in the canyon, to provide sustenance for herself, or possibly for her family. Kaiser watched her for a while, observing her techniques, understanding that the girl possessed a kind of natural talent for hunting, a kind of intuitive understanding of the patterns and signs of the land that was similar, in some ways, to the instincts that Kaiser herself had developed over the years. But Kaiser also understood something else about this girl. She was in danger. Kaiser could sense, through the carapace and through her expanded awareness of the underground caverns, that there was a disturbance in the depths, that there were creatures preparing to ascend through the canyons, that there was going to be an incursion of void creatures into the surface world if someone did not take action to prevent it, without fully understanding why, without consciously deciding to break the pattern of observation and distance that had characterized her relationship with the people of the surface world. Kaiser approached the girl. The girl was frightened at first. Kaiser understood this. She knew what she looked like, knew that her appearance was not human in any conventional sense. She knew that the carapace that covered most of her body, the dark and alien shell that had become so much a part of her, would seem monstrous and wrong to human eyes. But Kaiser spoke to the girl, and her voice, though it was distorted and filtered through the alterations that her throat and lungs had undergone, was still a human voice, still conveyed meaning and intention that was comprehensible to another human being. She told the girl what she knew. She told her about the void and the creatures that hunted in the depths. She told her that the people of the villages needed to prepare, that they needed to be ready for conflict, that they needed to understand how to starve the void rather than feed it through ritual and sacrifice. She told her the things that she had learned through 10 years of survival in the depths, the things that she knew from direct experience about what the void was and what it wanted and how it could be defended against. The girl listened. She did not run away. She did not attack Kaiser with her small bow. Instead, she listened to what Kaiser was telling her, and she asked questions, and she seemed to absorb the information and the understanding that was being conveyed to her. And then Kaiser's father came, and he saw his daughter talking to this creature of the void, and he did what many humans would do in such a situation. He rejected what he was seeing. He called his daughter a monster. He told his daughter to run away, to get away from this thing that was clearly a servant of the void rather than a protector against it. He drew his weapon, and he prepared to defend his daughter, to protect her from the danger that she did not understand she was in. Kaiser, seeing the fear and the misunderstanding and the certainty in the eyes of the man's, understood that she could not reach him. She could not convey to him what she was or what she was trying to do. She could only demonstrate it through her actions, through her commitment to protecting the girl and the man and the village they represented, even if that protection meant withdrawing and leaving them to face their misunderstanding alone. She turned away. She descended back toward the depths, leaving the girl and the man to continue their lives, leaving them to struggle with what they had witnessed, leaving them with the knowledge that something had tried to help them and that they had not understood or believed it. But she did not entirely disappear. She positioned herself just below the surface again, in the hidden places where she maintained her vigil, and she ensured that no void creatures were going to reach this particular village, that the girl who had listened and had seemed to understand was going to be protected, even if she did not know that protection was being provided. The girl would carry the memory of this encounter for the rest of her life. She would understand, in ways that her father could not, what Kaiser was and what she was trying to do. She would become a warrior or a protector herself, a person who stood against the void, a person who remembered that the monster in the canyon was not a monster at all, but a guardian, a protector, a being who had sacrificed everything in order to protect a world that feared and rejected her. Part 5. The Weight of Knowing. Chapter 10. The Burden of Isolation. As the years continued to pass, as decades accumulated into a kind of blur, Kaiser came to understand more fully what the cost of her transformation and her survival had actually been. It was not merely the loss of her childhood or the loss of her human life or the transformation of her body and her consciousness. There was something deeper, something more fundamental that had been taken from her and that could never be returned. It was belonging. She did not belong to the world of humans anymore. Her body was too transformed, too alien, too obviously a product of the void for her to be able to live among human beings without inspiring fear and revulsion. She could observe humans. She could learn from them. She could even protect them. But she could not truly be part of their world. But neither did she belong to the world of the void. She was not a pure creation of the void like the creatures she hunted. She was not driven by the endless hunger that characterized true voidborn. She retained her humanity, her capacity for rational thought and reflection and moral reasoning. She retained her memories of the world above. She retained, at some level, her connection to the human people who had created her, who had been the cause of her fall into the depths, even though that connection could never be fully expressed or realized. And so she existed in a kind of limbo, a space between worlds, belonging to neither and therefore having no true home or place of rest. This was perhaps the greatest cost of her survival, more significant even than the physical transformation or the loss of a normal human life. It was the loss of the possibility of ever truly connecting with another being in a way that transcended protection or observation or the maintenance of distance. There were moments during the long years of her vigil at the boundary between worlds when she contemplated the possibility of simply walking away from it all. She could descend deep into the caverns, deeper than she had ever gone before, and she could find some place in the absolute depths where the void was so pure and so total that it would overwhelm her, that it would consume her consciousness and integrate her fully into itself. In that way, she would finally cease to exist as a separate being, finally stop carrying the burden of her impossible existence, finally achieve a kind of peace through complete dissolution. But even as she contemplated this possibility, even as she sometimes moved toward the depths with the intention of pursuing this form of escape, something always stopped her. It was not hope exactly, though there was an element of hope in it. It was not fear of death, because death might have been preferable to the endless continuation of her existence as a being that belonged nowhere. It was something else, something that she gradually came to understand was the fundamental human impulse toward survival and continuation, an impulse that her years in the depths had only strengthened rather than weakened. And more than this, there was the duty. There was the knowledge that if she stopped her vigil, if she ceased to maintain her position at the boundary between worlds, then the void would expand. The creatures that she held back with her constant fighting and her constant presence would escape. They would reach the surface. They would consume the villages and the people and the world that she had left behind. So she continued. She maintained her vigil. She hunted. She fought. She protected, even though her protection was not recognized, and even though the people she protected often regarded her as a monster, and a threat, rather than as a guardian and an ally. Chapter 11. The suit awakens. At some point during her years of solitary vigil, Kaiser began to notice changes in the carapace that were different from the gradual expansion and enhancement that had characterized its growth since her initial encounter with the first creature she had killed. The carapace began to develop sophistication in its structure and its capabilities. It began to generate weapons and armor in ways that transcended simple hardness and protection. It began to produce projectiles and thruster mechanisms. It began to develop a kind of intentionality and awareness that was distinct from and separate to Kaiser's own consciousness. She realized during this period that the carapace was not simply a symbiotic organism that had fused itself to her. It was evolving. It was becoming more intelligent. It was developing its own consciousness and its own will, even as it remained linked to her own consciousness and her own will. This development was both terrifying and necessary. The creatures of the void were becoming more sophisticated as well, more adaptable, more dangerous. The weapons and armor that had been sufficient to defeat them years ago were becoming increasingly inadequate. The carapace, sensing this inadequacy, was responding by evolving, by developing new capabilities, by becoming more powerful and more lethal. But Kaiser understood that this evolution came at a cost. As the carapace became more independent, as it developed its own consciousness and its own desires and its own way of perceiving the world, it began to influence her thoughts and her feelings in ways that were increasingly difficult to distinguish from her own thoughts and feelings. She began to experience urges toward violence that seemed to exceed what was necessary for hunting or for protection. She began to feel a kind of hunger that was not merely physical hunger, but something more fundamental, a hunger that seemed to be transmitted through the carapace, a hunger for destruction, for consumption, for the annihilation of life. She struggled against these urges. She fought to maintain her own consciousness and her own values in the face of the growing influence of the carapace. She reminded herself constantly of who she was, of who she had been before the transformation, of the principles and the moral frameworks that had guided her in those earlier days. But the struggle was exhausting. The urges did not diminish. If anything, they grew stronger over time as the carapace evolved and as it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between its consciousness and her own. She began to understand, during this period, something about the nature of symbiosis and the nature of integration. She began to understand that over time, the boundaries between self and other, between her consciousness and the consciousness of the carapace, were beginning to blur and fade. She was not certain whether she was gradually becoming more like the carapace, or whether the carapace was gradually becoming more like her, or whether they were, in fact, gradually merging into something that was neither entirely one nor the other, but a genuine fusion of both. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. It was liberating because it suggested that perhaps the endless isolation and the sense of not belonging to either world was gradually being resolved, that she was becoming something entirely new, rather than being caught between two existing categories. It was terrifying because it meant that the person she had been, the human girl who had lived in a village and who had possessed certain values and certain principles, was gradually fading away, being absorbed into something larger and other. She found herself standing, on numerous occasions, at the edge of a great chasm that descended deep into the caverns, feeling the pull of the depths, feeling the call of the void, contemplating whether the time had come to surrender entirely, to allow the transformation to complete itself, to stop struggling against the current, and to simply allow herself to drift away into whatever lay at the end of this strange journey. But each time she came to the edge, she found herself unable to take the final step. Some part of her, some fragment of consciousness that remained tied to her original humanity, always pulled her back. Chapter 12. The Weight of Memory. As Kaiser reflected on her life, on all the years that had passed since her village had been destroyed, she found herself accessing memories with increasing frequency. Memories that seemed to have taken on a kind of surreal quality. Memories that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Someone that she had once been, but that she no longer was. She remembered her mother. She remembered the way her mother had urged her to stay inside the house, to avoid the unusual strangers who had been coming to the village. She remembered the love in her mother's voice, the concern that underlay the warnings, the fundamental desire to protect her child from danger. She had not appreciated that love at the time, or at least not fully. She had been impatient with her mother's warnings. She had seen them as unnecessarily restrictive, as a limit on her freedom and her ability to explore. Now, across the distance of decades, she understood what her mother had been trying to do. Her mother had been trying to protect her. Her mother had sensed, even if she did not fully understand it, that something was wrong, that danger was approaching, that the stable world of the village was about to be shattered. And she had tried, in the ways that were available to her, to keep her daughter safe. And Kaiser had ignored these warnings. Kaiser had freed the goats, had triggered the awakening of the void, had caused the destruction of her village and the death of her mother and everyone else that Kaiser had loved. For 10 years, she had carried this knowledge consciously, had understood the direct causal relationship between her actions and the catastrophe that had followed. In more recent years, as the trauma of the event had faded, and as she had come to accept her situation and her fate, she had tried to push this knowledge away, had tried not to think about it, had tried to focus instead on the duty that defined her present and her future. But the memory refused to be pushed away completely. It surfaced again and again, in moments when she was quiet or when she was not actively engaged in hunting or protecting or defending. It surfaced, and it brought with it the complex web of emotions that surrounded it. Guilt, certainly, but also understanding. And, gradually, something that might have been approaching forgiveness, though it was a forgiveness directed not at others, but at herself. She had done the best she could with the circumstances that had been forced upon her. She had survived against impossible odds. She had transformed her tragedy into a kind of purpose. She had made the lives that had been lost in the destruction of her village into something that had meaning, by dedicating herself to protecting others from the fate that had befallen her people. It was not redemption in any complete sense. It was not sufficient compensation for the lives that had been lost. But it was something. It was a way of living with the knowledge of what she had done, a way of continuing forward even in the face of that knowledge, a way of trying to create meaning from catastrophe. Part 6, the returning chapter. 13, the call from above. It was during a period when the void seemed relatively quiet, when there was a kind of lull in the usual pressure of creatures attempting to ascend to the surface, that Kaiser began to experience a new kind of pull from the carapace. It was similar to the pull that had first drawn her toward the surface all those years ago, but it was different in important ways. This pull was not drawing her toward the depths or away from them. Instead, it was drawing her toward a specific direction, toward a particular place, toward somewhere on the surface world that seemed to be calling to her with increasing insistence. At first, she tried to resist this pull. She had grown accustomed to her life in the boundary spaces, to her existence between worlds. The idea of venturing more fully into the surface world was troubling to her. She knew that she would be seen as a monster. She knew that her appearance would inspire fear and revulsion. She understood that her presence would likely cause panic and potentially violence. But the pull did not cease. If anything, it intensified over the course of weeks and then months. The carapace seemed to be becoming increasingly agitated, increasingly insistent, as though something fundamental to its well-being or its purpose was calling to it from the surface world. In the end, recognizing that resistance was futile, Kaiser began to move toward the source of the call. She moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows and the hidden places, trying to avoid being seen by any of the humans who inhabited the regions through which she traveled. But gradually, over the course of weeks of movement and effort, she drew closer to whatever was calling to her. The place she was being drawn toward seemed to be a city, a significant settlement, larger than the villages she had observed before, more densely populated, more complex in its layout and its structure. The city seemed to be under siege, or perhaps it was being overrun, attacked by void creatures in numbers that were larger than anything she had encountered recently. She understood, as she surveyed the situation from concealed vantage points around the city, that this was the thing that had been calling to her. The carapace had sensed this conflict, this overwhelming assault, this moment when the barrier between the worlds was about to be breached in a way that would be catastrophic if it was not stopped. And so Kaiser, who had spent years in isolation, who had come to accept her role as a solitary guardian, watching over the boundary between worlds, emerged from the shadows and revealed herself to this place and to the people who inhabited it. She became visible. She began to fight. She threw herself into the conflict with all of the strength and all of the skill that she had accumulated over decades of hunting and fighting and protecting. She was terrifying to behold. The carapace had evolved significantly over the years, had developed into something that was barely recognizable as something that had ever been human. As she fought, as she threw herself into the midst of the battle, she appeared as nothing less than a creature of the void itself, a being of darkness and power that emerged from the depths to wreak destruction on the forces that were attempting to overwhelm the city. But the creatures that were attacking the city cowered before her. The void creatures, despite their obvious alien and terrible nature, seemed to recognize in her something that they understood, something that transcended the apparent alliance with the humans that defended the city. They retreated. They fled. They sensed in her presence a predator that was as dangerous to them as it was to the creatures of the surface world. The battle, which had seemed to be going badly for the defenders of the city, turned. The creatures of the void were pushed back. They retreated toward the canyons and the caverns from which they had emerged. And slowly, gradually, the conflict ended. Chapter 14. The Rejection and the Understanding. In the aftermath of the battle, Kaiser emerged from the shadows fully, revealing herself to the people of the city. She walked through the streets, no longer hiding, no longer keeping to the shadowed places where she could observe without being observed. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Fear, horror, the instinct to attack and to defend against the monster that had emerged from the depths. Even though she had just saved the city, even though she had just fought against the creatures of the void to prevent the city from being overrun, she was still seen as a monster, still regarded with fear and revulsion. Some of the people of the city tried to attack her. They brought weapons. They tried to drive her away. She did not resist. She did not fight back against the humans. She simply allowed them to drive her away, allowed them to reject her, even as her heart ached with the knowledge that no matter what she did, no matter how many times she protected them, they would never accept her, would never see her as anything other than a creature of the void. But there was someone else there as well, someone who approached her after the chaos had settled, someone who looked at her with recognition rather than fear. It was a man who seemed to carry with him a kind of weight, a kind of burden that was similar in some ways to the burden that she herself carried. He looked at her with understanding. He did not seem to fear her. Instead, he seemed to understand what she was, or at least to have some inkling of it. He told her that his name was Kassadin. He told her that he had lost his family to the void. He told her that he had dedicated his life to fighting against it, to preventing others from suffering the loss that he had suffered. And as he spoke to her, as he told her his story, Kaiser realized something. She realized that this man was her father. Not in the biological sense, perhaps, but in a deeper and more fundamental sense. This was the man who had been searching for her, who had heard the rumors of a girl who had been taken by the void and who had somehow survived, who had gradually come to realize that this girl, this impossible survivor, was his daughter, the child whom he had thought lost forever. But the recognition was not simple. It was not the kind of joyful reunion that might have happened in other circumstances. Kaiser looked at her father, and she saw a man who had spent his life fighting against her people, fighting against the creatures that she had merged with, fighting against the void that had become as much a part of her as her original humanity. And she understood that she could not simply step into the role of his daughter, could not simply resume a relationship that had been shattered decades ago. She was not that girl anymore. That girl had been left behind in the moments of the village's destruction. So she did something that was perhaps harder than simply walking away. She allowed him to see her, to truly see her for a moment, to understand that his daughter was still alive, was still conscious, was still intelligent and aware and capable of love and connection. And then she left. She descended back toward the depths, back toward the boundary between worlds, back to the place where she belonged. It was not a perfect solution. It was not a reunion or a resolution. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement of connection, even if that connection could not be fully realized or expressed in the normal ways that familial bonds were expressed. It was a way of honoring the man who had been searching for her, of allowing him to know that the daughter he had mourned had not been completely lost, even if she was no longer entirely available to him. Chapter 15. The meaning of duty. In the years that followed the battle in the city and the strange encounter with her father, Kaiser came to understand more fully what the meaning of her existence truly was. It was not redemption, though it carried elements of redemption. It was not forgiveness, though it was a way of forgiving herself for the tragedy that she had inadvertently caused. It was not reunion or belonging, though it was a way of remaining connected to the world she had left behind, even though she could never truly return to it. It was duty. It was purpose. It was the understanding that she had a role to play in the world, a role that was defined by her unique position as someone who existed between the worlds, who understood both the nature of the void and the nature of humanity, who could serve as a barrier and a protector, even though that protection would likely never be fully understood or appreciated. She continued to hunt. She continued to fight. She continued to kill the creatures of the void and to prevent them from ascending to the surface world. She did this not because she believed that the people of the surface world were grateful, not because she believed that she would ever be accepted or understood, but because the duty itself had become sufficient meaning for her to continue. The isolation that she experienced, the sense of not belonging to either world, the constant strain of maintaining her humanity even as the carapace continued to evolve and to develop its own consciousness and its own will. All of these things remained, but they were tolerable, they were bearable, because they were in service of something, because they had meaning and purpose beyond the mere fact of her own survival. She had learned, through decades of living with the consequences of her actions and through decades of transformation, something fundamental about the nature of meaning and purpose. She had learned that meaning did not come from recognition or from appreciation or from others understanding what you had done or what you were doing. Meaning came from the commitment itself, from the choice to continue forward even in the face of isolation and rejection, from the willingness to bear a burden not because you wanted to, but because it was the right thing to do. She had come to understand, in other words, what it meant to be heroic in a way that transcended the heroics of stories and legends. True heroism was not about being recognized as a hero. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when no one was watching, even when no one would ever know or care or express gratitude. True heroism was about persisting in the pursuit of what was right, even in the face of fundamental and total isolation. Chapter 16. The Shape of Tomorrow. As Kaiser moved forward into the future, as she continued her vigil at the boundary between worlds, as she continued her endless hunting and protecting, she became aware that she was moving towards some kind of conclusion or transformation, even though she did not yet understand what that conclusion or transformation would be. The carapace continued to evolve. Her body continued to change. The distinction between her own consciousness and the consciousness of the carapace continued to blur. She did not know where this process was leading. She did not know whether she was gradually becoming something that was neither human nor void, something entirely new, something that had never existed before. But she had come to accept this uncertainty. She had come to trust over the long years in her ability to adapt and to persist, in her capacity to find meaning and purpose, even in the midst of transformation and change. She remained at the boundary between worlds. She remained vigilant. She remained committed to the duty that had become the entire substance of her existence. And she waited, with a kind of patient determination, for whatever came next. The people of the surface world would continue to fear her. They would continue to see her as a monster, as a creature of the void, as a threat rather than as a protector. She had made peace with this. There was no way to convince them otherwise. No way to bridge the fundamental gap between her nature and their understanding of what she should be. But there would be others. There would be those who saw her with understanding, who recognized what she was, who understood that she was protecting them even in the face of their rejection and their fear. For those few, for those who could perceive the truth of her nature, her existence had meaning and purpose. It was not the life that she would have chosen. It was not a life that included comfort or recognition, or the simple human pleasures of belonging and connection that she had known in her childhood. But it was the life that she had, and she had learned to find meaning and purpose within it. Epilogue. The resting place. Chapter 17. The quiet between battles. There is a place, deep within the caverns that lie beneath the southern reaches of Shurima, where Kaiser sometimes rests. It is not the shallowest of her territories, the places where she maintains her vigil and watches over the boundary between the worlds. It is deeper than that, a place that exists in the spaces between the regions where she hunts and the absolute depths of the void. In this place, she sits, sometimes for hours at a time, and she allows her mind to drift through the years and the memories and the transformations. She remembers her childhood with a kind of dreamlike quality, memories that have become so distant that they seem almost like stories that she has been told, rather than things that she has directly experienced. She remembers her village. She remembers her mother and her father and her friends. She remembers the taste of peaches and the feel of sunlight and the simple joy of playing with other children in the dust. These memories are precious to her because they represent the world that was lost, the world that was destroyed, the world that she had inadvertently destroyed when she freed the goats and awakened the void. But she does not allow these memories to become sources of despair or regret, at least not entirely. She has learned that memory is not about the past. Memory is about meaning, about the way that the past illuminates the present and shapes the future. She thinks about the girl in the canyon, the girl who had listened to her warnings about the nature of the void, the girl who had seemed to understand what Kaiser was and why she was doing what she was doing. She thinks about her father, Kassadin, and the strange recognition that had passed between them, the connection that could be acknowledged but not fully realized. She thinks about the countless people that she has protected without their knowledge, the villages that she has saved from void incursions, the lives that she has preserved by maintaining her constant vigil and fighting her endless battles against the creatures that threaten the surface world. and she understands that her existence, as tragic as it has been in many ways, as filled with loss and isolation and transformation as it has been, has nonetheless had meaning and purpose. She has made a difference. She has saved lives. She has protected a world that fears and rejects her. This understanding does not erase the pain of her circumstances. It does not make the isolation easier to bear or the internal struggle between her human consciousness and the growing consciousness of the carapace less difficult or less exhausting, but it provides a kind of framework within which that pain and that difficulty can be understood and contextualized and lived with. Chapter 18. The Unknown Future. Kaisa does not know what will come next. She does not know whether she will continue to exist as she has been existing in this strange liminal space between worlds, hunting and protecting and remaining fundamentally alone. She does not know whether the carapace will continue to evolve, will continue to transform her into something increasingly alien, something increasingly difficult to distinguish from a creature of the void. She does not know whether the barriers between the worlds will eventually be breached in ways that her vigilance cannot prevent, whether the void will eventually overrun the defenses she has established, whether the world above will eventually be consumed by the endless hunger that characterizes the depths. She does not know whether she will ever find a way to belong, whether the fundamental isolation that has defined her existence will eventually be resolved through some form of connection or integration that she cannot yet imagine. What she does know is that she will continue to fight. She will continue to hunt. She will continue to maintain her vigil at the boundary between worlds. She will continue to protect a world that does not understand her and that will likely never understand her. She will do these things not because she believes they will ultimately succeed in preventing the void from consuming everything. She will do these things not because she expects recognition or gratitude or acceptance. She will do these things because they are the right things to do, because they are the duties that have defined her existence, because they are the only way she knows to create meaning from the tragedy of her circumstances. And in doing these things, in continuing forward in the face of uncertainty and isolation, and the knowledge that her efforts are ultimately a kind of holding action, a way of preventing things from becoming worse, even if they can never become significantly better, she embodies something fundamental about the nature of heroism and the nature of human existence. She is a survivor. She is a protector. She is a guardian of boundaries. She is a being who exists between worlds and who uses that existence as a kind of purpose, a way of serving something greater than herself, even though that service will likely never be fully understood or appreciated or acknowledged. Her story is not a story of triumph or victory, or the achievement of some grand goal. It is a story of persistence and commitment, and the acceptance of a difficult and isolated existence as the price of doing what is right. And perhaps that is the most important kind of story. The story of the person who continues to do what needs to be done, even when no one is watching, even when there is no reward or recognition, even when the task seems insurmountable and unending. The story of the person who transforms tragedy into purpose and who finds meaning not in the resolution of their circumstances, but in the commitment to engaging with those circumstances with integrity and with courage. Kaisa descends back into the depths. She moves through the caverns toward the places where she hunts. She positions herself at the boundaries where she maintains her vigil, and she continues. She continues to protect. She continues to fight. She continues to exist in the strange liminal space that has become her entire world, and she does these things with the knowledge that this is not the life that was meant for her, but it is the life that she has, and it is, in its own difficult and painful way, enough. The depths call to her with their eternal hunger. The surface world remains forever beyond her reach, and between them, on the boundary, in the spaces of shadow and stone and danger, Kaisa stands watch. She stands guard. She maintains the barrier that holds back the endless consuming hunger of the void, and in doing so, even though she may never know it, even though she may never receive recognition or appreciation for what she does, she saves the world day after day, year after year, century after century, for as long as she remains alive and capable of fighting. This is her story. This is her purpose. This is the meaning that she has found in her tragic and difficult and isolated existence. And perhaps that is the greatest heroism of all. The end, in the depths below Shurima, where light is strange and time moves differently. There remains a guardian. She was not born to be a hero. She was not chosen by fate or called by destiny. She was simply a child who wanted to free some goats, who wanted to do what she thought was right, and who paid the price of that simple action with her entire life and her entire future. But in paying that price, in accepting her fate and her transformation, in finding purpose and meaning in a life that was not of her choosing, she became something more than a hero. She became a light in the darkness, even though she herself is made partly of darkness. She became a protector of a world that fears her. She became the guardian at the boundary between worlds. This is her story, and it is still being written in the depths below, in the eternal struggle against the hunger that seeks to consume all things.